Okay, so I've finished this add item panel now. Um, this is good enough for now. If you wanted to, if you're actually going to make a more in-depth checklist, you might want to have more of these input objects, but we don't really need that right now. Okay, so the last thing that I do need though for this panel is I need a button to make it clear that I want to create a new item. I need to switch, so I don't want to be in this arrow mode anymore, so I'm going to switch so I can move this easier. Maybe right here. This will be the create button, not to be confused with the add button. The width is fine, I think. Make the height a little bit bigger, and this button will say create. And I'll probably want to color the button a little differently than the add button, just so it's obvious that they're different. So let's make this maybe a blue or something. And then I think I'll change that text to white. Great. Okay. Okay, this looks pretty good. This is my add panel. This button should also be a part of this inner panel. Awesome. And then now, let's say that I've hit this create button and I want this panel to close. Basically through code, I'm just going to uncheck this box. And then when I want to hit add, I'm going to recheck the box. And that's basically how this is going to work, switching between this add item and just the normal checklist. I'm going to leave it off for now because I don't want that in view. I think I'm actually going to change this background color too of this inner panel. I don't know what I want it to be. Maybe I even just want it to be entirely, no, not entirely transparent. Maybe a blue, actually. Yeah, that seems pretty good. Let's change this text so it shows up. And let's change these inner text so they show up. Also, I don't think I want these panels to show up. And by panel, I mean this background that the name is showing up on. So I think I'm just going to make it entirely transparent and hit apply. I don't want to apply the text because that will change it back to name. So I just want to apply this. There we go. And then maybe I want to change the text color to white. And now, once again, I will actually, let me also maybe increase this text size. It seems kind of small. And I will also apply, this time on the text, but not all of the text. I just want to change the font size and not the name. It doesn't give me that option, so I guess I'll just change both, and I'll go back into this text object and change it back to type. Okay. I think that looks good. Turn off the add panel. There we go. We've got our checklist. If I hit play, that bottom bar should disappear. It did. I can scroll. Now I can check these. They don't do anything yet, so I think we're finally ready to add the functionality behind this. But this is the basic structure of the checklist. So now let's start writing some code. I've got some scripts that I've already created, but they're empty. I'm going to open them up close that. It should be these. Okay. So this is the checklist manager script. This script is just going to, it's basically going to do everything. It's going to control the entire checklist. So I'm going to start by creating some public variables. I'm going to need access to that content object in order to populate the checklist, because I'm based on whenever they add a new object to the checklist or what I'm loading from the JSON file, I'm going to need to add objects as children to this content object so that it will populate the checklist with toggles. The next thing I need is a game object, and this will be that panel, that add panel. And I just need this to be a game object so I can toggle it active and inactive based on whether they're currently trying to add a checklist item or not trying to add, or just in the regular checklist. I'm going to need access to the autocomplete. So button, I need a button. It's showing up as an error because I have not added the directive yet. UI is needed for buttons, text, input fields, etc. So public button, and this will be that create button. I need this button so that when the user hits that create button, which is this button I'll be giving it through the editor, I can check what's in the input fields to see if or to store that data and save it in JSON. And then I also need a checklist item prefab, and this is just the toggle essentially that I'm going to be instantiating every time a new checklist item is added to the checklist. Okay. I'm also going to be saving and loading JSON, and so I need a location to save this information. So this is going to be file path. I'm not going to create I'm not going to create the path yet. So mainly because the path is going to end up looking like this: application.persistent data path plus then this would be whatever I want to call my file. So I'm going to call my file, let's see, checklist.txt. It'll be a text file. You can say JSON too. Either one's fine. This should have one now. Or did I spell something else wrong? Oh, 2 P's. Okay. So this is what my file path would look like, but I actually can't call this application.persistent data path in the global variable part, or the variables for this entire script, because application.persistent data path is not accessible before before all these other beginner functions. So I can't call this here, and instead I need to call it in start, which is why for now I'm just going to leave file path as blank, and then we'll have start, and in start I can now set file path equal to that location. Let's see, what else do we need for member variables? We need a private list of checklist objects. Checklist objects we haven't created yet, but I'll show you what those are in a second. This is actually going to be checklist object tutorial, and this is basically going to hold all of the objects that are all the toggles that will be inside our checklist. So why don't we open up this script real quick, and this is actually spelled wrong. It should be checklist, which means I also need to change the file name here. So this is actually a good lesson in case you make a mistake with the naming of a script. If you change the script name, you also have to change the class name. You have to change it in 2 locations, otherwise it's just going to cause an error. I changed it in both locations, so now it's fine. And it actually now updated my other script, which I need to reopen, which is not reopening. Come on. Okay, so now if I go back to my checklist manager, you can see it now knows what this object is because I fixed that spelling error. So let me quickly go into this checklist object tutorial. So this object is basically a single instance or a single version of a checklist item. So this is a single toggle. And we're going to be using this class to create a bunch of these, and we're going to store them, and so we can save and create these objects whenever we start the application. So this object is going to have some member variables. We want its name. I can't just say name because name already exists. You can see it's our object.name already has a name. So instead we're just going to call it object name. We're going to have a type, and we're going to have an index, and this index just is the where this object is in the checklist. So index 0 is going to be at the top of the checklist. Index 10 is going to be the 11th item in the checklist. And then we also will need access. Now this text is an error because we aren't using Unity engine.ui. We also need access to the toggle text. So every toggle we're creating, we're going to need to edit the text to reflect the name. So basically we're going to be setting this text to equal this name. And then later, if you also want to show the category or the type or something like that, you could also, add that to this text. So I'm just going to create a start function, and we're just going to want to grab that text object. Since we're grabbing the text object attached, or actually as a child of the object with this script, so if I go back into Unity, that checklist object is going to be one of these checklist items. So let me actually add it real quick. Checklist object. This will be the checklist object. The name would be carrot in this case, the type vegetable, and you can see that the text object is called label. This text object is a child of the object holding the script, checklist object toot. So if we go back to the script, we can call getComponent in children, and we can say text. And this will look in the children of this object. So another way to put this is this dot get component in children. We don't need to do this, but normally you would give get component in children some kind of object. So if I had another game object, example, I would say example dot get component in children, and that would look for a text object in the example object. But since we're looking for this text object in the object holding this script, we don't need to say this. We can leave that out. So get component in children text. And then now that we have this text object, we just want to say item text.text equals object name. And then based on whatever the name is, at start, it will set the name, or it will set the text to that name. Great. And then the last thing I want to do in this script is I want a way to update or change the info that this object is holding. So we're going to give it a name, we're going to give it a type, and we're going to give it an index, and we're just going to change the name equal to the name that was given, the type equal to the type that was given, and the index equal to the index that was given. So this is just a simple function to update all this information. Okay, great. So I will go back to our checklist manager, and now this is pretty much all we need for this script, this checklist object tutorial. I'll go back to the checklist manager, and now we're ready to start creating each of these checklist objects. So whenever we create an object, we're going to need to add it to this list of objects, and this is how we will know what all of our current objects are, so that when we remove an object or add an object, and then we decide to save or load from our JSON file, this is how we'll know what we should be saving, whatever's in this list. So I'm going to also have one more member variable that is those input fields, and I'm just going to call it add input fields because that's what it is. It's the input fields for adding, and these are just like the name and type input field, which we're also going to need to get in start. Oops. So I will say add input fields equals, using our add panel, because this add panel has those input fields, we can just get components in children of type input field. That's it. Oops. So get components with an S will grab all of the components of the given type. Now, since the only components with input fields that are children of the add panel are the input fields we're looking for, this is a very quick and simple way to easily grab all the input fields we need, and we just store them in this array. Okay. Now let's create a function that switches between the regular checklist and adding to the checklist. So I'm just going to have an integer, and this integer determines whether we're trying to switch to the add panel or back to the normal checklist. I'm going to use a switch statement for this. So if mode is 0, then we want to set the add panel to inactive, because this is, let me just actually add regular checklist mode, and then we need to break afterwards, and then case 1. If you're unfamiliar with switch statements, that's fine. You can look up how they work. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's basically like a bunch of if statements. So add panel dot set active to true and break. So let me also add really quick another. So this case is adding a new checklist item. So the case 0 is for when we just added a checklist item and we're switching back to the regular checklist. Case 1 is when we're on the regular checklist and we're starting to add a new checklist item. And so this will just switch between those two. And then later, if we had, say, a remove panel, we would basically just add that here and we would switch to it as well. So this is just an easy way, or a good way, to allow for lots of different UI switching. Okay, that's it for that script, or that function. Now we probably want to start populating the checklist. So let's create a function that will add to the checklist. So I'm going to call this create checklist item. And to create this checklist item, we're going to want all that information, the name, the type, and the index. So I'm going to have the name, the type is also a string, and then the index is an integer, and then that's it for what we need in the parameters. And what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate we're going to instantiate a game object. I'm going to call it item. And this object that we're creating is basically one of those checklist item prefab objects. It's basically a toggle. So we need to give instantiate that prefab. And there are other parameters you can give it, but we're not going to. We're just going to give it the prefab. So it will create, now it'll create a version or an instance of that checklist item prefab, and it will store it in the game object item. We're going to want to change the parent of this item, because remember, we want it to be a child of that content group, so it'll join that layout group and lay out nicely. So we're going to set the parent to content. We are going to want to grab this object's checklist object 2. So checklist object equals item.getComponent checklist object 2. Okay, so we know for a fact that this object is going to have this checklist object too, because our checklist item prefab will have this checklist object tutorial. So we're just grabbing this specific instance of that prefab. We're grabbing that specific instance's checklist object so that we can basically set the information that we've gathered. So we can then call item object dot set object info, and we just give it the info from above, so name, type, and index. And then we also need to make sure we add this checklist object toot to our list from up above, this list. So we want to say checklist objects dot add, and we just give it item object. This way we are storing it for later when we want to save. And then we need to let's see. Oh, we need to add a function to the toggle so that when the toggle is pressed, it does something. So we can say something like, with our item object, we can, actually first we need to get the toggle. So once again, we know this object has a toggle because it's this prefab object. And then we say on value change. This means the user pressed the toggle. Dot add listener. And this is where it gets a little more complicated. So we want to add a listener for a function when the user presses the toggle. I think before I go any further, we're going to write that function. So we'll come back to this. For now, I'm just going to put a semicolon. And so let's create that function that's going to go in there. And that function is going to be check item, basically checklist item. And we need to give this object, or this function, a checklist object toot. And I'm just going to call it item. And so, let's see. And so in check item, we're going to want to we want to think about what happens when we check off an item. When we check off an item, we want to remove it from our list because it means that the user is done getting that item, and we also want to remove it from the JSON file because it means that the user no longer needs to load that checklist item whenever they reload the application. For now, we're just going to do the part where they're moving from the list, and then we'll do the JSON part later after we first learn how to write to JSON. So we're just going to remove it from the list, so checklist objects dot remove. We give it that specific one that we want to remove, which in this case is this item. So for now, that's all we're going to do for that function. Now, how do we call it? So normally you would give this add listener, you would give it a function without the parameters because the parameters will, or it shouldn't have any parameters. In our case, our function has a parameter, so we have to go about this a little differently. So normally, if you had no parameters, you would just say check item, like this, and then it would call your function. Because we have parameters, we can't, you can even see what it says, cannot convert from method group to unity action bool. So it has a parameter, so this won't work. So the other way to do this is to basically create an outer function that calls our function that has no parameters. So that's what I'm doing. So delegate creates a function, and inside this delegate we can call check item, and now we can give it parameters because technically this delegate, this outer function, doesn't have any parameters. It's the inner function that does. And then what we want to give check item is this item object. And then because it's inside function, we need a semicolon, and then that's pretty much it. Something to be wary of if item object changes, because this is happening at runtime. If item object is changing, whatever the last version of item object is for every button or for every toggle, it's going to use that last version, and we don't really want that. So just in case, a nice way around this is to create a temporary separate object. So I'm just going to call it temp, set it equal to item object, and then use temp instead. And this way it won't be dependent on item object, it'll be dependent on this temp that was just created here. In this case, it should be fine either way because item object isn't a global member, which means it's only local to this function. But if, say, you were trying to use a parameter for some value out here, just some member variable, that member variable is obviously going to change throughout the process of the application, and whatever its final value is will be the value stored here. So just for good practice, I'm going to leave this as temp, but it shouldn't matter. Okay, so we now have our checklist items. We need to call create checklist item, and we need to do that in start or whenever someone adds. So why don't we set this up to call it whenever someone adds to, or using the add panel, add something to our checklist. So in start, we're using that create button. So we're going to do something very similar to what we just did, where we're going to grab the listener, in this case on click instead of on value change, add listener, and then we're once again going to want to delegate. And we basically want to call create checklist item, and we have to figure out what parameters we want. So the parameters are the input fields. So we can input fields 0, input fields 1, and then that's the input field. Now we need the text for the input field. The text for the input field, and the index. The final thing we need is the index. Since we don't know the index here, I think I'm actually going to change this. So instead of being given the index, we'll make it so we set the index ourselves. And we're going to do that just based on how many objects are currently in the checklist. So I'm just going to create int index equals checklist item, or sorry, not checklist item. It's what's it called? It's called checklist objects. Checklist objects dot count -1. So say we have 3 objects and we're about to add a 4th object. If we're thinking in index form, if we have 3 objects, that means 0, 1, 2 are the indexes. If we're adding a 4th one, the new index we want is 3, because then we'll have 0, 1, 2, 3. And we get that by taking the count 4 and subtracting 1. So that's how we get this index. And then we give that index to this object info, and that's how we know when we load where this object should be in the checklist, just to keep it consistent. So then in this create button, we no longer need that index. Let's also check real quick that if there's no count in checklist objects, is it going to be a problem? So if the count is 0 and we subtract 1, that's going to put us at -1, which is obviously not an index we want. So what we need to do is we need to check if checklist objects.count is greater than 0, and that means this, I'm just going to set it to 0 by default, and then there we go. So it's going to default to 0 if the count is greater than 0 of the checklist objects. It'll change it. If not, it's still going to be 0, so that's fine. Okay. So this should allow us now to create a new checklist item just by hitting add. The last thing we need to do is we also need to make sure that once we finish this function, create checklist item, that we switch modes. So switch mode, we want to switch back to 0, right? Because we want to deactivate the add panel and switch back to the checklist. The other thing we have to do is be able to switch to the add panel. So, but that we don't need to do here. We can do it in the editor. So I go back to the editor, give it a sec to load, and I click on my add button. I can go to this button component and this on-click feature. I can add to this on-click feature. I need to add from checklist manager, but we don't have an object yet that is our checklist manager, so I'm going to quickly create an empty object. We'll call this checklist manager. I'm going to reset. You don't have to reset the position to 0, it looks nicer. And I'm going to give it this checklist manager script. I need to populate it with these parts. Content is content. Add panel is add panel. Create button is, where is create button? Here's the add button. I don't need that. I need the create button, and the checklist item prefab is in my prefabs. Checklist item. Okay. So I'm going to apply this change to this object. That's basically what I'm applying is the fact that I added this checklist object to. I'm going to delete all of these, and then through code we're going to instantiate those back. But the last thing I need is I need to go back to this add button, and I need to drag in this checklist manager and set its function to switch mode, which isn't showing up. And it's not showing up because I forgot to make switch mode public. If it's not public, it will not show up. So now that I've made it public, I can go back to this on click, and switch mode. And this should switch to mode 1, which in this case mode 1 is the add panel. So let's try it. Here's our add panel. I will type in carrot, vegetable, hit create, and there you go, it created the carrot. If I check it off, it doesn't do anything, so there must be a mistake with something we did, but at least the add works for now. Let's do peas. Okay, great. Let's figure out why it didn't remove. Let's go to our checklist item prefab. If we go into our script, here's where we're creating the checklist item. The toggle on changed should call check item, and then check item should remove the item. Oh, it's removing it from the checklist, but it never deletes the object. So the other thing we would need to do is destroy item.gameObject. So this will destroy the toggle. So let's try that one more time. Caret, the type will be vegetable, and it removes it. Great.